To you, the saints, grace and peace to you. This sermon recap is for Easter, the year C, the year of Luke, preached at University Lutheran on March 31st, the year 2013. A gathering of Easter to hear from Luke 24, the women coming to the tomb, finding it empty, first perplexed, then terrified, and then the two men dazzling white, and as they tell the story, they call them angels. But clearly for Luke, there is this consistency of two, that resurrection is part of the same story that transfiguration is, or vice versa, that transfiguration is the part of the story of resurrection and ascension. And so they go running back and having seen the empty tomb, having seen the two men in dazzling white, and the men who say, "Why do you look for the living amongst the dead? Don't you remember what Jesus told you when you were in Galilee?" And then remembering, the women go back and tell the disciples what they've seen. It seems to the apostles an idle tale. It's a stronger word than that in Greek. They think it to be nonsense. And Peter goes and finds the tomb empty and goes home amazed at the happening of the day. Easter morning, a time to kind of gather up the pieces that have been for Holy Week. And so on Thursday night, Jesus, who has a last thing in the Gospel of John, after all the I ams in John, all the people seen and places gone in John, as the last thing, Jesus tells his disciples to love one another. This is how the world will know that we belong to the Christ, that in the end, as the last thing, the I am bends and takes a towel and becomes servant and commands us, teaches us to love one another. This is how we're going to smell like Jesus. A couple sermons back. And that Jesus smells like Mary, the sister of Martha, the sister of Lazarus, and so, and that Mary smells like love. And so not to miss the point on Monday, Thursday, that this Jesus who bends and takes a towel and washes his disciples' feet with a basin of water has everything to do with Mary a few chapters earlier, washing Jesus' feet with perfume, with nard, and wiping them dry with her hair. One commentator said that in the days of Easter that people do not need to be wowed, W-O-W-E-D, but loved. And so on Monday, Thursday, and yesterday morning, Easter morning, that people should know that Easter is about the clear, unmistakable love that God has for us. This unquenchable, this love that will not be detoured, this love that is everlasting, ever-relenting, never-relenting love that God has for us. Friday, my sermon was based on a poem by A.H. Auden, A-U-D-E-N, called The Manger, about how Mary, the mother of Jesus, needed to teach. She laments in the poem that she needs to teach the Son of Man to weep. That Good Friday seemed for all the world to be a weeping, and so in our own sadnesses, in our own lives, in our own stories, that we come to Easter, we come to Holy Week, well aware of our weeping. That Jesus, in Mary singing to him the Magnificat, she sings to Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1, that one holy imagination is that she sings it as a song as she cradles, as she nurses Jesus. She sings the same song to him, so that his first sermon in Nazareth in the synagogue in Luke chapter 4, they hand him the scroll of Isaiah. He reads the scroll. He sits and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, sight to the blind, release to the captive." It's the same song. And yet Auden says in his poem that Mary teaches Jesus to weep. On Easter then, of that being loved of Maundy Thursday, of weeping, that we make room for on Good Friday, that on Easter that we would be taught to remember, and that we'd be taught to whisper and taught to live. One of my members on Thursday left worship quiet tears because she had just experienced the loss of a very, very close family friend. And so I actually kind of reshaped the sermon after Thursday night in light of in experiencing her sadness as she left worship, and how Holy Week contains not only the hope of the Holy Week, the hope of Easter is precisely for those tears. And so I talked about all of our tears, all of our sadnesses from last Easter, and that these people who have come, these women who have come to the tomb, they're told to remember what Jesus said, and somehow in the remembering, it's enough for them to turn. There's enough in the remembering and seeing the empty tomb and remembering what Jesus says that they return in that and go and tell the others what they've seen and what they've heard. That sometimes we forget the profound hope that is the resurrection of Christ in our lives. Sometimes we forget the profound hope that is Easter in all of our lives. But in remembering what Jesus says, it allows us to re-remember the shape of our own lives. It allows us to reshape and remember our own stories in a different way. It allows us to remake the very memory of ourselves and to reshape that in some form that is hope. And so for this young lady, in the remembering of all that Jesus says, to remake and reshape the very memory of this person who has died, and to do it in a different way that is hopeful of the resurrection. As part of that, kind of a personal ending to the sermon, that many years ago, in fact, I can tell you, in 1988, my grandfather was dying of cancer. This is before I was ordained, though studying to be, was in the seminary at Wartburg Seminary, studying to be a pastor. And my grandfather in the hospital cleared the room, and it was just he and I. And he was yellow and sick and frail and in his last days. And he says to me, will you speak over me? And I didn't even understand at first what he was asking, but he was asking me to preach at his funeral. And so, as part of the sermon yesterday, I got out my funeral file, and these are the funerals that I've preached. These are just sermons and files for folks that I've preached funeral sermons for. And I asked the question, how do you speak over somebody? How do you speak over your grandfather once he's died? And it really comes back to the Luke that we remember the things that Jesus says. That allows us to reshape and remember our own lives. And so that is the hope of Easter. That is the hope of any funeral service, I think, that we remember what Jesus says. And so again, that's why it's so important that we know what Jesus says. It's so important that worship and that scriptures are known in a way that we can remember, that we can know the text that on this mountain God will make a feast of fat things, of wine strained clear, of wonderful things. That there on that day God will wipe away the tear. And that's the text, the second lesson yesterday, that from Corinthians, that death is the last enemy that Jesus puts under his feet. One commentator said that the good news of the gospel, the good news of Jesus as this Jesus as this Messiah, that the good news is finally and only known when death is dethroned, not simply embarrassed, not simply unmasked, not simply inconvenienced, but the good news that is the gospel of Jesus Christ is only known finally when death is defeated, when death is dethroned. And the resurrection of Christ is that. Paul says that we of all people are most to be pitied if we've only hoped in this life. The resurrection of Christ allows us to hope in this life, in reshaping it, in knowing the hope, but of life forever. The whisper comes in. So we remember, we re-remember, we reshape, we remake, we speak and tell the story. We tell what Jesus has said over one another, for one another, to one another. But finally a whispering. When my grandfather asked me that, and it's kind of been a secret of mine, that ever since, every funeral I do, there at the cemetery or there at the church, There's a last line in the committal, and some of you will be familiar with this. There's a kind of a promise, may light perpetual shine on him or her. And then typically the second line, and they can be reversed, and eternal rest grant him, O Lord. I've always used that line as a time to bend toward the casket or bend down and whisper into the ear of the one who lies to rest. And may God grant you rest and resurrection. That the promise of Easter is not simply, that the promise that is the hope is not simply for those who hear it over and around the one who rests, but it is for the one who rests himself or herself. That we shout, Christ is risen, he is risen indeed, and we remember together the things that Jesus says and does and goes and promises and bends and washes our feet, that we are loved by this Christ, but that we also whisper in the really difficult times of life, that we whisper into the ears of the one who dies. God grants you rest eternal, but God also grants you a rising, a resurrection, and a hope. In these holy days of Easter, grace and peace in all things, be well.